Red hair is usually treated today as rare, striking, and a little bit lucky to be born with. For most of recorded history, it was treated as a warning sign. Imagine being born with a trait that instantly made strangers suspicious of you, not because of anything you did, but because of a single gene you had no control over. No trial, no evidence, just the color of your hair deciding, before you spoke a single word, what kind of person people assumed you were. Red hair is caused by a mutation in a gene called MC1R, which controls how much of two pigments your body produces in skin and hair. Most people produce mostly a dark pigment called eumelanin. People with red hair produce mostly a reddish pigment called pheomelanin instead, and it takes two copies of the mutated gene, one from each parent, for the trait to appear at all. That is why it is recessive, why it can skip generations, and why it can suddenly appear in a family where nobody remembers seeing it before. Globally, redheads make up somewhere around 1 to 2% of the population. In parts of Scotland and Ireland, the number climbs far higher, sometimes above 10%. Genetically, this looks like ordinary variation, spread unevenly across ancestry the same way height or eye color spreads unevenly. Historically, that uneven spread was almost never treated as random. Ancient Egypt gives us one of the earliest recorded associations between red hair and danger. The god Set, associated with chaos, storms, and the harsh red desert itself, was frequently depicted with red hair and red skin. Red was Set's color, the color of destruction rather than fertile black soil that surrounded the Nile. According to some Greek historians writing about Egypt centuries later, red-haired individuals were considered unlucky, and a few ancient sources even describe red-haired men being singled out during certain rituals connected to Set. Modern historians treat these specific claims with real caution, since much of what survives comes from outside observers rather than Egyptian sources themselves, and some of it may reflect Greek assumptions more than genuine Egyptian practice. What is certain is the association itself, repeated across centuries of religious art and writing. Red meant Set. Set meant chaos. Chaos was not a color you wanted to be born wearing on your head. The Egyptian calendar even carried a quieter version of the same fear forward. Certain days were marked as unlucky specifically because of their connection to Set, and by extension, to the color red itself. A child born on the wrong day with the wrong hair color could find both facts working against them before they had done anything at all. 2 strikes before their first breath. Ancient Greece continued the suspicion, just dressed in philosophy instead of religion. Several Greek writers describe red-haired people as hot-tempered, untrustworthy, and closer to animals than to civilized humans. The philosopher Xenophanes noted that different peoples imagined their gods looking like themselves, and yet even within Greek thought, red hair was rarely given to gods considered wise or trustworthy. The Thracians, a group the Greeks considered wild and barbarian, were frequently described as red-haired. Being red-haired in Greek writing did not just describe your appearance. It quietly placed you outside the boundary of who counted as properly civilized, a visual shortcut for everything Greek writers considered untamed. Comedy of the period leaned on the same idea. Red-haired characters in Greek theater were frequently written as foolish, cowardly, or dishonest. A stock-type audiences would recognize the moment the mask appeared on stage. You did not need a single line of dialogue. The hair alone told the audience who not to trust. One glance, instant verdict. Rome inherited the same suspicion and pointed it outward, at its enemies. Julius Caesar, writing his own account of the wars in Gaul, described the tribes he fought as tall, fierce, and often red or reddish-haired, a description that fed directly into how ordinary Romans pictured the enemy waiting beyond their borders. Germanic tribes were described the same way. Red hair became visually tied to everyone Rome considered a threat on its frontier, repeated so often in Roman writing that hair color and hostility became almost the same idea. At the same time, red-haired slaves captured from conquered territories were considered exotic in wealthy Roman households, sometimes sold at higher prices purely because of hair color, prized as a novelty in the same homes that feared the same trait on a battlefield. The same feature that marked you as a dangerous outsider, while armed could mark you as a curiosity once you were in chains. Rome, it turned out, was perfectly willing to fear you and profit from you using the exact same detail. Norse mythology complicated the picture rather than simplifying it. Thor, one of the most powerful and beloved gods in the entire pantheon, was frequently described as red-bearded, his hair tied to strength, storms, and protection rather than chaos. In parts of Scandinavia, where red hair occurred naturally at some of the highest rates in the world, the trait could not easily be treated as a foreign curse, because too many ordinary people and even a beloved god carried it. Fear of red hair was never universal. It was regional, shifting depending on who was writing the story and which god they needed it to represent. By the medieval period, the suspicion fully merged with Christian religion across much of Western Europe, and it became far more dangerous to actually live with. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus, was overwhelmingly depicted in medieval European art with red hair and a red beard, at a time when almost no other biblical figures were shown that way. This was not incidental. Red hair became visual shorthand for betrayal itself, painted onto church walls and stained glass windows where entire villages saw it every single week, generation after generation, without anyone needing to explain why. That religious suspicion fed directly into the witch trials. Red hair was frequently listed as a physical sign that someone might be a witch, alongside other markings considered evidence in courts that had no real evidence at all. A birthmark, a missing tooth, a limp, and red hair could all be read the same way by an accuser determined to find guilt. How many women were reported to authorities because a neighbor simply disliked them? How many of those reports specifically mentioned red hair as supporting proof, listed alongside a mole or a stray cat seen near their home? How many trials treated a genetic trait, something no accused person had any control over at all, as if it were a signed confession? Werewolf accusations in parts of France and Germany carried a similar undertone. Some regional folklore linked thick red body hair specifically to suspected werewolf transformation, tying the same pigment mutation to two separate supernatural fears depending entirely on which century and which village you happened to be born into. Nobody asked the accused what they believed. The hair was the evidence. The hair was the whole trial. Strangely, the Renaissance briefly interrupted this pattern, at least among the wealthy. Painters including Botticelli and Titian began portraying red hair as beautiful, associating it with divine femininity and idealized beauty rather than danger. Titian painted so many red-haired figures that the specific reddish-gold shade eventually took his name, still called Titian red today. Queen Elizabeth I of England, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, was famously red-haired, and portraits of her from the period treat the color as a mark of majesty rather than suspicion. For a brief stretch, in specific courts and specific paintings, the same trait that had been evidence of witchcraft became evidence of royalty instead. The fear did not disappear. It simply paused for those wealthy enough to have their portrait painted, while ordinary red-haired people in surrounding villages remained just as vulnerable to accusation as before. In parts of Eastern Europe, the suspicion took an even stranger shape after death rather than before it. Local folklore in some regions held that red-haired people were more likely to become vampires once buried, alongside other groups considered marked at birth, such as children born with a caul or an extra set of teeth. Burial practices in some communities specifically adjusted for this belief, including extra precautions like placing stones or iron near the body, precautions not taken for neighbors buried in the same graveyard without red hair. A trait controlled entirely by a single gene had somehow become, in the minds of entire villages, evidence about what might happen to your body after you were already gone. By the way, if you want the full extended series on how the human body has been misunderstood, feared, and mythologized across history, with more detail and more sources than a single video can hold, there is a deeper breakdown linked in the description. New episodes added regularly. Link below. Now back to the hair. Spain added its own layer during the Inquisition, and the stakes there were higher than almost anywhere else in Europe, because red hair was statistically more common among certain populations in parts of Europe and the Middle East. It was sometimes treated, unfairly and inaccurately, as circumstantial evidence of Jewish or Moorish ancestry during a period when that ancestry could get you formally investigated, tortured, or worse. Inquisitors were not trained geneticists. They were looking for any physical marker that could support a suspicion they had often already formed for other reasons, and hair color was an easy, visible detail to point to in a system actively hunting for exactly that kind of evidence. A trait that had nothing to do with religion or personal belief was folded into a legal and religious apparatus built to punish exactly those things. The suspicion did not stay contained to Europe. As colonization spread European folklore across the Atlantic, some of the same associations traveled with it. Early colonial writings in parts of the Americas occasionally repeated the same stereotypes about red-haired temperament and untrustworthiness, applied now to a much smaller population scattered across entirely new continents, proof that a superstition does not need local logic to survive. It only needs people willing to keep repeating it. Even science, once it finally arrived, took a strange detour before helping. 19th-century physiognomists, researchers who believed physical appearance could reveal inner character, specifically studied red hair as part of their now thoroughly discredited field. Some published papers seriously arguing that red hair correlated with criminality, based on nothing more than selective observation and existing cultural bias, dressed up in the language of measurement and charts. The superstition did not end when formal science began. For a while, it simply borrowed science's credibility and kept going. Here is where the story genuinely reverses. Centuries of pure superstition eventually collided with real biology, and in this specific case, the biology turned out to be just as strange as the myth, just true instead of imagined. The same MC1R mutation responsible for red hair also affects how the body processes pain, and this is not folklore. It is documented modern medical research. Redheads have been shown in clinical studies to require meaningfully more general anesthesia than people without the mutation to reach the same level of sedation, sometimes by a significant margin. Separate research suggests redheads may also be more sensitive to certain types of sharp pain, while simultaneously showing higher tolerance for other types, an inconsistency that puzzled researchers for years before the mechanism became clearer. The receptor affected by the MC1R mutation sits in the same general signaling pathway the brain uses to interpret pain, which means a gene that only appears to control pigment is quietly rewiring part of the nervous system at the same time. The discovery itself happened almost by accident, the same way so many real medical breakthroughs do. Anesthesiologists in the 20th century began noticing a pattern they could not immediately explain. Certain patients seemed to wake up mid-procedure, or complained of pain despite receiving what should have been more than sufficient sedation for their body weight and age. For years, this was sometimes dismissed as anxiety, exaggeration, or simple bad luck in the operating room. It took careful, repeated observation before anyone connected the pattern specifically to hair color, and even longer before researchers isolated the exact genetic mechanism responsible. What looked at first like an inconsistent, unreliable group of patients turned out to be a consistent biological signal that medicine had simply not been organized to notice yet. Once the mechanism was confirmed, it changed real clinical practice. Some anesthesiologists now factor red hair into pre-surgical planning, adjusting dosage expectations before the patient ever enters the operating room. A trait that spent thousands of years as folklore evidence in which trials had become, almost overnight by historical standards, a legitimate clinical consideration written into modern medical guidance. Not because of curses, not because of chaos gods, betrayal symbolism, or vampiric burial rites, because a gene that only appears to control pigment happens to also sit inside the same signaling pathway the brain uses to process pain. For thousands of years, people across entirely unconnected civilizations built elaborate supernatural explanations for a trait whose real explanation was sitting quietly inside a single strand of DNA the entire time, waiting for genetics to catch up with the question. Not every civilization treated red hair as a warning. In parts of ancient China, red was primarily associated with luck, celebration, and protection against evil spirits, worn deliberately at weddings and festivals rather than avoided. Red-haired individuals were rare enough in the general population to be treated more as a curiosity than a threat, without the accumulated weight of a specific chaos god or betrayal myth attached to the color the way Europe eventually built one. Context decided everything. The same shade that meant danger in one hemisphere meant celebration in another, purely depending on which stories a given culture had already told itself about the color before a red-haired person ever walked into the room. Compare that history to how red hair is treated now. It shows up in advertising as rare and desirable, used deliberately to make a product or a character stand out from everyone around them. It gets its own dedicated festivals in some countries, drawing thousands of red-haired attendees to celebrate the exact trait that once got people investigated by witch hunters and inquisitors in the same regions centuries earlier. Genetic testing kits will now cheerfully tell you if you carry the recessive gene. No suspicion required, no chaos god involved, just a report generated from a tube of saliva mailed to a lab. The same 1 to 2% of the population that used to be quietly watched, buried differently, and painted as traitors is now, across most of the modern world, simply watched with curiosity instead of fear. The reversal did not happen everywhere at the same pace, and it was never fully complete. Even today, playground name-calling and casual stereotypes about red-haired temper have not entirely vanished, a faint cultural echo of centuries of suspicion that technically ended without ever being formally declared over. Old fears rarely announce their own retirement. They simply fade until nobody remembers exactly when people stopped believing them, if they ever fully did. The story of red hair was never really about hair at all. It is about how quickly humans will build an entire belief system around something they cannot explain, and how long that belief system can survive once it exists, passed down through art, law, and folklore long after anyone remembers why it started. A single mutated gene did not choose to be feared. People chose that for it, generation after generation, across empires that never spoke to each other, and centuries that never overlapped, until science finally offered a quieter, stranger, more accurate answer than chaos ever did. They painted it onto gods and traitors. They wrote it into trial records. They buried it differently than everyone else. They studied it, misunderstood it, and occasionally worshipped it, sometimes within the same century. Eventually, they sequenced it instead, and the mutation that once explained curses turned out to explain something far stranger and far more human. The exact reason your body might need a little more medicine than your neighbor's, hidden the entire time inside the same gene everyone had spent thousands of years afraid of.